part 2 of chapter 11, Ratio Magic for Managing by the Numbers by Chuck Kramer and Ron Rizzuto with John Chase. Okay. This ratio is part of another useful measure, the assets to equity ratio, or total assets divided by equity. An assets to equity ratio of 1 means the company has 0 liabilities. A ratio of 3 means it has $3 of assets for every dollar of equity, or $2 of liabilities for every dollar of equity. The assets to equity ratio is sometimes known as the financial leverage or the equity multiplier. It shows how much you're leveraging your equity using other people's money. It's the responsibility of a company's owner, or whoever is accountable to the owners, to manage this ratio so that the business remains on firm financial ground. In larger companies, this is the job of the CEO and CFO. In small companies, it's the job of the people who are running the business, who may be the owners themselves. If the company is delivering a healthy ROA, and if these managers utilize an appropriate amount of financial leverage, they can deliver an even healthier ROE, return of equity. The reason, of course, is that they are using not only their own money but other people's money. It assumes that a higher level of assets generates a higher level of profit, which is often the case. How much is too much financial leverage? Financial institutions aside, we have observed that most established companies rarely go above the 3.0 assets to equity ratio. During the 1980s, many companies did and found themselves in financial hot water. Chastened by this experience, financial managers typically tried to get the ratio back down during the 1990s. Companies naturally have to keep their assets to equity ratio in line with what the lenders expect so that the lenders don't get nervous. And lenders usually get nervous when any single ratio goes beyond their standard tolerances. Another interesting thing about ROE, or return on equity, is that you can use it to assess any company's performance against any other companies, regardless of the industry. In that sense, it's the ultimate financial measuring stick. Average return on equity for large American companies as a group fluctuates between 10 and 20%. In good economic years, the average is closer to 20%. In bad economic years, it's closer to 10%. Of course, there are plenty of variations on both ends of the scale. Microsoft's ROE for fiscal 1999 was 35%, while a troubled company such as Boston Chicken had a negative ROE. But if your company is in that 10 to 20% range, you know your ROE is at least adequate. By now, you may have figured out the rest of DuPont's equation. It looks like this. You can read that out loud. Which is net profit over sales times sales over assets equals net profits over assets times assets over equity equals net profit over equity. Or return on sales times asset turnover equals return on assets times financial leverage equals ROE, return on equity. This formula, known as the extended DuPont equation, is handy because it breaks down the ultimate financial goal for business owners, a healthy return on equity, into all of its components parts and helps them understand how to manage each one. Let's review each term in the equation and the strategies associated with it. Return on sales, net profit over sales. You manage the return on sales by managing the sales and expenses. The key ratios you watch are the cost of goods sold over sales, if you have cost of goods sold or an equivalent term, and MSG over sales, which is operating expenses over sales. Almost every company wants its sales to grow, but over the long haul, no company can afford to have costs and expenses rising faster than sales. 2. Assets turnover, sales over assets. You manage the asset turnover by increasing sales faster than assets by decreasing assets, or both. The key assets to watch in this context are receivables and inventory, since these are most likely to vary in the short term. The key measures are receivable days and inventory days. Return on assets, which is net profit over assets. Return on assets improves when sales rise faster than expenses and or assets. Chapter 8 and 9 focus on how to manage sales, expenses, and assets, such as receivables and inventory. Analyzing return on assets, ROA, covered in Chapter 10, forces you to look at your other assets such as cash balances and fixed assets. Number 4, financial leverage, assets over equity. The assets over equity ratio itself is a great tool to show you whether you're taking appropriate advantage of other people's money. If it's close to 1.0, you may be running your business too cautiously. You may want to take on more debt. If it's higher than 3.0, you may be out on a limb. Then you need to take the opposite move, retire some debt. With financial leverage, more isn't always better. Number 5, return on equity, ROE, net profit over equity. For many investors, ROE is the ultimate financial measuring stick. It shows whether an investor is better off over the long term investing in this business or putting money into something else. Your company's ROE must be competitive with alternative investments, or you'll have a hard time attracting any investment. Soho Equipment. Bill and Carolyn can use the extended DuPont equation to analyze their 3-year performance at Soho Equipment Incorporated. We showed the first part of the formula in Table 11.1. So now all that's necessary is to add the financial leverage term and figure out the ROE for the years in question. And this is 11.2. And this is what it looks like. What does this show? The Michaels already knew the bad news, which was that the ROA, the return on assets, declined between year 2 and 3 from 6.01 to 3.7%. The good news they discovered is that Soho improved its financial leverage from 1.21 in year 1 to 1.44 in year 2 and 1.64 in year 3, while keeping the ratio well within reasonable bounds. As a result, ROE didn't drop as much as it might have. When you're doing this kind of analysis, you need to have all the relevant numbers at your fingertips. Not just the equation itself, but all the sums and ratios. You'll need to understand what it all means. We have developed a 1-page summary sheet that we think provides a handy format for this purpose. It shows the DuPont equation together with the key ratios from the financials and the 3 bottom lines discussed in Chapter 5. For Soho Equipment to year 3, our summary sheet would look like Table 11.3 on the next page, which is here, and it's pretty detailed. So, this goes over net profits over sales, sales over average assets, net profit over average assets over average equity, and net profit over average equity. Oh, those are a lot of numbers. Okay, so we got cost of goods sold from income statement, the operating expenses, which is marketing, selling, general and administrative expenses from income statement, sales from income statement, all balance sheet information calculated from Table 9.2, key asset ratios, and cash flow information. If you prepare this summary sheet to go along with your financial scoreboards, you'll have all the financial information you need to assess your company's performance for a given time span right at your fingertips. For example, if return on assets isn't where you'd like it to be, you can see at a glance whether you have poor return on sales, poor asset turnover, or both. If the problem lies in return on sales, you can see at a glance whether the chief culprit is cost of goods sold over sales or operating expenses over sales. Create summary sheets for every year your business is operation, and you could begin to spot trends, even without going to the trouble of charting the results. Once you get accustomed to using these, indeed, you'll find that unusual or troublesome numbers jump right out at you. Planning with ROA and ROE graphs. Using financial analysis for planning and projection is covered in the next chapter, but there's one planning tool we want to introduce while the discussion of ROA and ROE is still fresh in your mind. It lets you compare your current returns with where you'd like to be and figure out how to get there. The tool is based on a simple mathematical fact. If you can multiply two numbers together to get a third number, then you can construct a curve showing all the different combinations that would produce that third number. So the first one is graph 11.1, which is this one right here. And this has all the components that they were just talking about. So let's see if we'd like to go here. Oh, that is so... You can't really see that. For example, you can produce an ROA of 20% with an ROS of 2% and an asset turnover ratio of 10. Or you can do it with ROS of 10% and an asset turnover ratio of 2. Or you can do it with any combination of those two numbers that multiply out to 20%. The 20% ROA curve is shown on graph 11.1. You can draw similar curves for 10% ROA, 40% ROA, and add any other number shown on graph 11.2. So it looks kind of like this. So these are like possibilities. Now suppose you take the same graph and plot Soho Equipment's ROA for year 2 and 3. It would look like graph 11.3. This one right here. So that's Soho's. Say Bill and Carolyn decided that they wanted an ROA of 20%. Look at the shortest distance between Soho Equipment's existing ROA and the 20% curve and draw it in. Don't worry about the math, just eyeball it. Interesting. Now look at the point on the curve you have hit. Draw a line down the asset turnover axis. Interesting. If you remember your high school math, draw a line across the ROS axis, the vertical or the y-axis. The quickest, easiest way for Bill and Carolyn to get to the 20% ROA they want is to raise their asset turnover to about 5.0 and their ROS to about 4.0. See graph 11.5. So they figured it out here. I'm going to take a screenshot of that or pause it. Where'd it go? Of course, this is just a guideline. You also have to use good business judgment. If your ROS is high compared to your industry average, you may not be able to raise it that much, and you may have to concentrate on improving your asset turnover instead. But this guideline holds an important lesson. Despite what your accountant might tell you, the best route to a better return on assets is almost never achieved by purely holding down expenses so as to increase profit. And despite what your VP of sale might tell you, it's almost never achieved by increasing sales while holding assets steady. You need to do both. Improve your ROS, return on sales, and improve your asset turnover. The return on assets curve offers handy guidelines for figuring out where to put your priorities. You can perform a similar analysis with return on equity, which is like return on assets, which like return on assets is the product of two terms. In this case, the two terms are ROA itself and financial leverage, or assets divided by equity. The equation looks like this. ROA times financial leverage equals ROE, or net profits over assets times assets over equity equals net profit over equity. And it looks like that. Okay. Just as with ROA, you can make a curve showing your desired ROE as a product of two factors. Put ROA, net profits over assets, along with the vertical y-axis, and financial leverage, assets over equity, along the horizontal axis, x-axis. Construct a curve for the ROE you'd like to have, and and plot points showing where your ROE had been in recent years. Then, to do the same exercise, draw the shortest possible line to the curve from where you are now. The point hit shows the easiest combination of ROA and financial leverage to get you to your desired ROE. For example, if Bill and Carolyn wanted to figure out how to get 20% ROE, the exercise would look like graph 11.6. It would look like that. They can see from the graph that the quickest and easiest way to get to their goals, other things being equal, is to increase their financial leverage of about 4.0 and the return on assets to about 5%. Of course, 4.0 is too high for financial leverage, but the graph suggests that they might want to increase their leverage as much as they believe prudent. The key here is to remember what the return on equity brings to the party, other people's money or liability. The higher your liabilities, the higher your financial leverage, and the higher your ROE, all else being equal. You can increase liabilities by borrowing more money. Naturally, you don't want to borrow too much, or you'll put your business in jeopardy. Remember, interest expense will increase, so all else won't be equal. But if your ROA is healthy and your ROE is lackluster, it's a safe bet you aren't taking full advantage of the leveraging opportunities that are opening to you. Some judicious borrowing can help your assets/equity ratio and thus your ROE. The end, Chapter 11. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll join you again with Chapter 12, Forward-Looking Financials. Thanks for watching.